Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1081 for November 3rd, 2024. Coming up in a few minutes.
If someone tells a joke, Mark, and I'm looking at myself here, I find that not everybody's going to find my sense of humour funny. And it's a little bit the same with Ardbeg, so I wouldn't get too hung up about that.
This week we're playing Ask the Distiller with Dr. Bill Lumsden of Glenmorangie and Ardbeg, with questions submitted via the WhiskyCast Community app. We'll cover everything from why the new 17-year-old Ardbeg was chill-filtered and bottled at 40% ABV, to what it was like working with Beyoncé on her new Sir Davis whiskey. That's coming up on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Gabriel Cardarella from Jewers here. The 2024 U.S. Open Championship may have ended, but you can still get your hands on the whiskey created to honor it. The new Jewers 19-Year-Old Champions Edition. Trust me, a whiskey you don't want to miss. More details coming up.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Betrayal, a kick in the teeth, a broken promise. Those are the words the Scotch whisky industry is using this week, following Chancellor Rachel Reeves's budget address on Wednesday. She announced a hike in excise duties on Scotch and other distilled spirits of 2.7% in line with inflation, while cutting taxes on draft beers and ciders by 1.7%. I talked with Scotch Whisky Association CEO Mark Kent on Thursday.
We've made clear, Mark, that we, in our experience in the government's own figures, just raising further tax does not mean you're going to get more money into the revenue for the exchequer for public services. And indeed, the government figures show that the opposite is the case. The last time that the previous Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, raised the tax rate by 10.1%, that led to a fall in £300 million for the Treasury revenue. But this was compounded then by a cut in beer, and this was from a government, beer and draft rates more generally. This is from a government which had promised that it would back Scotch whisky to the hilt. And what we've seen as a result of this is that we've been put at further competitive disadvantage to other alcohol categories such as beer and cider. So a lot of disappointment, not to say anger, not to say feeling of betrayal within much of the Scotch whisky industry. So it was a very grim day yesterday.
A lot of the reaction that has come in indicates that it's really no surprise that the government did this. Had you been hoping for a tax cut, realistically?
Well, we think that would have made the most sense in economic terms, and that's why we put this forward, because the figures showed that every time there's been a freeze or a cut in the rate, the amount of income gained to the exchequer has grown. Now, we recognise there are some who are more in favour of the status quo, which is stick up the tax rate and hope for the best. But really, that the figures have shown that this isn't the best way to raise money for the exchequer and to put more money into the growth agenda and public services. So the Treasury ends up losing revenue, and there's less money to invest for creation of jobs and growth in the Scottish economy, which is what is desperately needed at the moment.
This goes against the promise that Keir Starmer made to support Scotch whisky to the hilt, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and we've made that point, and others in the industry have made that point. So it's not just that failing to support us is actually putting us in a worse position than we were before the budget started. So there is a lot of strong feeling within the industry, and sort of I've spoken to people within the industry have said this is a kick in the teeth for Scotch and for Scotland. Used words like betrayal, which I don't think is too strong. There is a lot of feeling about in the industry at the moment that we have not been justly treated.
Has the Chancellor given any kind of logic behind this decision?
We've spoken to government officials, to ministers, and we haven't received a very convincing explanation of this at all. And it's, as I said to you, Mark, it's not just the rise in the rate, it's the fact that there is this is coupled with a cut in duty for draft alcohol categories such as beer and cider. 99% of our producers do not have access to this. So it's put us at a competitive disadvantage, which is difficult to understand.
On top of this, you're facing tariffs in the U.S. again if a certain person gets elected next week. He's already pledged to stick tariffs on all imported goods, including Scotch whiskey. And this time it would go even further than the last tariff, which only included single malts. It would theoretically would include all Scotch whiskeys, including blended Scotches. Where does that put the industry in terms of just being able to survive a tariff increase?
Well, Mark, as you know, the US is our most important market. And in addition to that, we are very closely linked with the US whiskey industry. There's a lot of our companies who have distilleries in both countries, but also just the connection via the trade in barrels. And so many of our casks come from the US, come from bourbon. So anything which gets in the way of tariff-free trade really is a big concern to us. And obviously, as you say, it's not just us who are looking at the results of the election next week and what's going to happen, but we are in close touch with our partners in the US, with other associations, to make the case for continuing tariff-free trade and looking to have that seamless that seamless trade, because last time this happened and the tariff was put on single malt Scotch, this cost us over £600 million, and it had serious consequences for our US colleagues as well. I mean, the top selling whiskey in the UK is not a Scotch, it's a bourbon. So really, we hope that we can continue to make the case for tariff-free trade, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, and in the sort of follow-up to the US election, which of course we can't prejudge, and that's for a choice for the US people to decide. But we'll be in close contact with our US colleagues over the next few days just to see how things are really.
Kent and his colleagues are urging members of Parliament to vote against the tax hike when the budget comes up for a vote in the next few weeks. However, an intra-party revolt by Labour MPs is not expected. In other news, distilling has returned to Scotland's Cabrach Valley for the first time in more than 170 years. The Cabrach distillery held its opening ceremony on Monday at Inverherrick Farm. The distillery is a community-owned social enterprise with the goal of reviving the Cabrach area. Bacardi has completed work on an expansion project at Altmore Distillery in Speyside. The project includes a new still house, boiler house, and tun room, and will double the distillery's production capacity. The upgrades are designed to be energy efficient as well, with the boiler having the ability to run on hydrogen or natural gas. Bacardi has also built 3 new warehouses at its Poniol maturation and blending facility in Glasgow. The new warehouses are designed to increase capacity by 15% over older warehouses at the site. Meanwhile, Buffalo Trace has unveiled this year's antique collection bottlings. This year's George T. Stagg is a 15-year-old bourbon that comes in at a hazmat level 68% ABV. There are also the cask-strength William LaRue Weller bourbon and Thomas H. Handy Sazerac rye whiskies, along with the Sazerac 18-year-old rye and Eagle Rare 17-year-old bourbon. The official recommended retail price for each one is $149.99 a bottle. Good luck finding them priced at list price, though. Crown Royal is dropping its Reserve blend in favor of a new 12-year-old Crown Royal Reserve. The new whiskey amps up the fruitiness on the palate and will be available starting this month with a recommended retail price of $49.99 a bottle. Redwood Empire Distillery is releasing 2 new bourbons. Batch number 2 of the Screaming Titan wheated bourbon comes from a 4-grain mash bill with 30% wheat. And batch number 2 of Devil's Tower is a high rye bourbon with 44% rye in the mash bill. Both are priced at $79.99 on the Redwood Empire website. Wyoming Whiskey is releasing Queen of the Tetons, which honors the bear known to researchers as Grizzly 399 during her time along the Snake River. The 28-year-old bear was the region's oldest known reproducing grizzly bear and was tragically killed in a car accident near Grand Teton National Park recently. The distillery will be donating $20,000 to the Grand Teton National Park Foundation to support grizzly bear education, research, and conservation programs. The whiskey is available at the distillery in Kirby, Wyoming, the Barrel House in Jackson, and select Wyoming retailers. Seattle's Westland Distillery is taking a different tack with this year's edition of Garyana Single Malt. The 9th edition in the Garyana range still blends Garyana oak with sherry cask matured whiskey, but this year's release uses Oloroso sherry instead of PX sherry. It'll go on sale starting next Monday at Westland's online shop and will arrive at retailers starting November 15th. The recommended retail price is $149.99 a bottle. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Kentucky's Jephthah Creed Distillery is releasing its 3rd annual batch of red, white, and blue Kentucky straight bourbon. It's distilled from a mash of Bloody Butcher red corn, heirloom white corn, and the distillery's own bespoke strain of blue corn. It'll be available starting Thursday, with a portion of the proceeds going to the veterans charity Creative Vets. The recommended retail price is $75 a bottle. Scotland's Holyrood Distillery is releasing its first U.S. export whiskies. Ambir is designed using fruity yeasts and matured in ex-bourbon barrels, while Embra is a peated single malt. Both whiskies are available through Holyrood's website as well. Ambir is priced at £64 a bottle, while Embra is priced at £67. No word on U.S. pricing as of yet. I received samples of both this week, and will have my tasting notes for them soon at WhiskyCast.com. And finally, Drinks International has released its annual list of the world's most admired whiskeys, and Michter's tops the list for the 2nd straight year. The rankings are determined by a poll of independent drinks buyers, journalists, bartenders, and whiskey experts from around the world. Yamazaki and Chichibu came in 2nd and 3rd, followed by Springbank at number 4 and Johnny Walker at number 5. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast Community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the calendar and see what's happening around the world of whiskey. Tickets are still available for the Buzzard's Roost Bourbon Dinner at Bourbon's Bistro in Louisville this Thursday night. Whiskeys of the World is in Seattle, Washington on Saturday night. Saturday also brings us the Sagamore Spirit Maryland-made release party at the Distillery in Baltimore. The Whiskey Exchange hosts its 2025 Whiskey of the Year tasting on the 13th at its Great Portland Street shop in London. Whiskey Fest Chicago is on the 15th, and the World Whiskey Experience is on November 15th and 16th in London. I'll be at the New Brunswick Spirits Festival, November 19th through the 23rd in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Whiskey Fest New York is on the 20th, and Whiskeys of the World hits Chicago on the 22nd. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at WhiskyCast.com and in the WhiskyCast Community app.
Every year, Dewar's, the official Scotch whisky of the U.S. Open Championship, rolls out a special limited edition whiskey to celebrate that year's tournament. The 2024 championship wrapped up in June, but the 2024 Dewar's 19-year Pinehurst edition is available now, and you don't want to miss it. This year's 19-year whiskey is double-aged, then extra matured in rye casks, offering a rich profile with notes of pear and heather honey. There's a hint of spice in there too, along with a dusting of cinnamon and cocoa powder. It's a sensory delight for any true whiskey or golf fan. So trust me, my fellow aficionados, grab a bottle and enjoy a whiskey crafted with the same skill and precision that makes the U.S. Open legendary. Please drink responsibly. Copyright 2024. Dewar's Blended Scotch Whisky, 46% alcohol by volume. Imported by John Dewar & Sons, Coral Gables, Florida.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban and the Classic Malts lineup. Dr. Bill Lumsden of Glenmorangie and Ardbeg is one of the most outspoken people in the entire whiskey world. I've interviewed Bill countless times over the past 19 years, so this time I decided to let you do the hard work of coming up with the questions. Thanks to the many WhiskyCast Community app members who submitted some hard-nosed and tough questions for this edition of Ask the Distiller. So we put out a call for questions in the WhiskyCast Community app and got a bunch of responses. A lot of people have questions for you, Bill.
I'm highly delighted at that. I would have been very disappointed if there wasn't any questions.
We'll start off with the Ardbeg 17.
Yep.
J.D. Hostetler asks, I'm sure others have asked this, but I'm wondering what Dr. Bill's reasoning for the Ardbeg 17 being bottled at 40% ABV when all other Ardbegs are more craft presented. You also chill filtered this one too, right?
Yep. So it's a very, very good question. And I obviously knew I was going to be asked this. And, there's nobody who wrestled with this situation more than myself. And the simple reason why I did it was that, our original 17-year-old Ardbeg was, of course, the very first Ardbeg bottled by the Glenmorangie company. And, when we bought the distillery back in 1997, we inherited a little bit of bottled stock from Allied Domecq, including quite a few bottles of the old 30-year-old. And we knew from the stock profile that it was going to be some years before we were ready to re-release a 10-year-old. So at that time, the youngest of the old stock, i.e. 1980, was, guess what, 17 years old. In these days, Mark, I was Glenmorangie distillery manager, so I did not have the influence I have on the whiskey now. So the decision was not made by myself, but the original bottlings of Ardbeg 17-year-old were 40% ABV, and they were chill filtered. So I felt, and I'm going to come back to chill filtered because there's chill filtered and there's chill filtered. So I eventually, and I had a lot of debate with Gillian in my team and also with Tom, the CEO of the company at that time. And eventually I thought, well, it would be a little bit unfair to bottle the new one at, for example, 46% ABV and non-chill filtered, because I was kind of hoping that most Ardbeg aficionados like myself were going to directly compare the before and after. So it was simply to create a level playing field for that to happen. Now, the final part of my answer to that is that our chill filtration regime in the Glenmorangie company is much, much more gentle than in most other companies. So I don't take the temperature down to anything like 0 degrees, between 6 and 8 degrees, and I use a slightly wider pour filter. So even these whiskies, which are chill filtered, if you bung the bottle in your freezer for a little while, you'll see it going all gloopy. And most importantly, you still get that nice texture. Whereas if it's a particularly harsh chill filtration, the whiskey tastes thin. But I totally understand that I may have ruffled a few feathers out there. But, it was finally my decision simply to create a level playing field of then and now.
Might we see a 17-year-old unchill filtered and bottled at 46%?
It's not impossible, Mark. It's not in the pipeline at the moment, but yes, it would be a nice kind of third stage of the story as well for comparative purposes. So yeah, all I can say at the moment is it's not impossible.
Tom, the Tracer Bullet, says, Dr. Bill stated that Glenmorangie Signet was one of his, quote, proudest innovations. With the release of Glenmorangie Signet Reserve, is that statement still true?
I would say so, because, Glenmorangie Signet Reserve is fabulous. And, it's taken the taste profile off in a slightly different direction. but essentially the underpinnings of that are still the normal Signet. So basically for the Signet Reserve, I'm taking tiny quantities of an already small volume product, and instead of bottling it as Glenmorangie Signet, I'm then redirecting it into other places to finish the maturation. So I don't think the release of Glenmorangie Signet Reserve has changed that view. Now, that's not to say that there haven't been one or two other things that might have slightly changed my mind there. And there may be things in the future to do that. But certainly to answer that question, no, the Signet Reserve is a variation on a theme. And I would say, Mark, because you always like me to give you a little titbit more than you ask for. It's not necessarily going to be the last sort of offshoot we see of Signet.
Okay. Watch this space, I assume, right?
Watch this space, of course, of course.
Question for me and Bruce, and also from Tyrone Cote, wants to know what you've been doing with the lighthouse up at Glenmorangie. What unique features and findings have you discovered with distilling up there? And what are some of the experiments that you've been doing with the new facility?
Right. Obviously, as you know, I can't say too much about that, Mark. And you've asked me that very question yourself. But I'll give you some clues here. According to the Scotch Whisky regulations, there are only 5 cereal grains that we are legally allowed to use to make Scotch whisky. So the lighthouse perhaps has given me the opportunity to use all of these.
Okay. Which 5 are they? I know there's barley, obviously, and rye. And corn.
So there's barley, there's rye, there's wheat, there's corn, and there's oats.
Interesting. Haven't had an oat Scotch whiskey yet.
Yeah. There's, it has been done. And again, these grains have been used historically, and I'm going back long, long way. But, what I would also say here is that, I didn't have the lighthouse built to allow me to only make Scotch whisky.
Interesting.
And, I'm kind of, sorry, I'm just replying here. I haven't, the one area that I haven't really quite yet got to grips with is the different things I can do with fermentation. Because of course, my fermentation vessels at the lighthouse, I can control the temperature in that. I've always been fascinated by the way that wine is made, because as you know, Mark, I'm a wine lover, and a typical wine fermentation will last, sometimes several weeks. And obviously, for a classic Scotch malt whisky fermentation, that would end very badly indeed in terms of the lactobacillus in there. But I'm looking at using the temperature control to allow me to lengthen things. So that's going to be a big focus for me. So I probably better not say too much more.
Let's move on to Sir Davis for a second. Mr. Pye wants to know, have you met Beyoncé? I know you have. What was it like working with Beyoncé on the Sir Davis whiskey?
Yeah, no, it was an absolute thrill for very obvious reasons. And I was always a great admirer of Beyoncé, not just as an artist, but as a person and some of the things she's done. So I found Mrs. Knowles Carter to be very, very charming, very clear on what she wanted to achieve with this. So she was a fascinating partner to work with. And at the end of the day, my role in this was to try and take her desires, her dreams, and her tastes in whiskey, and then bring that alive in the form of her own product. And so we're very proud of where we've got to with that. And of course, as you know, Mark, we just launched that back in on the 4th of September, which is Mrs. Knowles Carter's birthday.
It's not bad for MGP product.
Well, I've always been a big fan. I know you're being slightly provocative here, Mark, but I've always been a big fan of them, and I think they do some great stuff. But of course, from our perspective, they're very much tailoring it to our needs. So we have exclusivity on that particular mash bill.
Let's move on now, and this is going to be a provocative question from Rick at the Whiskey Zone. There's been pushback in some quarters about not just the number of Ardbeg special releases, but the gimmicky marketing around them. Do you think that kind of marketing is necessary to sell Ardbeg to a younger demographic? And will we see more of it if there's a softening of sales in the market?
That's quite a meaty question, that. And, when we relaunched the Ardbeg brand back in the late 1990s, the brand had been almost forgotten, but all but the most hardcore of people. So we had a clean sheet in which to relaunch the brand. And what we tried, I believe very successfully to do, was to respect the heritage and traditions of that brand, but bring it alive in a bit of a fun way. I'd love to believe that we still do that. So while the marketing might seem a little bit quirky to some people, and the current platform is to do with weirdness and the comic books and things like that, I just think that people maybe need to take a step back and think, this is just a bit of fun. And obviously, if someone tells a joke, Mark, and I'm looking at myself here, I find that not everybody's going to find my sense of humour funny. And it's a little bit the same with Ardbeg. So I wouldn't get too hung up about that. But, in terms of the number of releases we've had recently, we have heard comments from people out there thinking that maybe there's a little bit too many for them to keep up with. And, we listen to our consumer feedback. But, I can put my hand in my heart here, Mark, as someone who's been around right from day one of our ownership of Ardbeg to say, don't be afraid. It's in very, very good hands, and we'll do everything we can to continue to delight people with our Ardbeg releases.
And the Tracer Bullet responded to that also with not having the cask strength committee bottling this year was not a good deletion. Why was there not a cask strength committee bottling?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, Mark, we maybe judged that a little bit wrong in that, and we are looking at reintroducing that, to be honest. It was really just for purposes of simplifying the distribution of it. But, we understand that people really do like the higher strength versions. It's interesting you say that, Mark, because from knowing me for years and years and years that I personally am not necessarily a huge fan of cask strength whiskey. That's not why the decision was taken. It was maybe just a little bit of an oversight, to be honest.
HRC has another provocative question. Do you fear turning off some fans with the super premium pricing trend, and do you see any signs of a market recalibration on the horizon?
Yep, but I think that's a question that could be leveled at the whiskey industry in general. I know there are many, many very, very high-priced expressions out there, and there is a market for that. But what I would say to that is, and I'm a very passionate advocate of this myself, because I really want my whiskies to be democratic. And, much as I'd love to be buying £15,000 bottles of DRC Montrachet each year, I'm not. It's above my pay grade, Mark. But guess what? There is demand for it out there. And it's the same for whiskey. But within our ranges, I honestly believe we've got something to suit every pocket in there. But yeah, it's a fair point that many, many brands out there are recognizing that there is a space for super deluxe ones. But as I say, I would argue very passionately that for every £10,000 release we do, we still have, $40 and $50 products there.
Pete at Whiskey Ranked poses an interesting question. Glenmorangie recently increased the age on the flagship 10-year-old to a 12-year-old, and a few years ago on the Quinta Reuben without a significant change in price. They were fine, so why? He just doesn't get it.
I can very, very clearly answer that question. That, we're always looking at ways of tweaking and improving our offerings. And, I sat down with the CEO and the marketing director quite a few years ago, and we kind of looked at what we had, and in that debate came up the thing, because they both knew how much I love Glenmorangie Original. It was the first single malt Scotch whisky I ever tasted. It's pretty much what got me into the category. And, it's probably been my favourite in our range ever since. So the challenge that I set myself as much as anyone else was, could we actually make this even better? So I looked at various ways of doing that, and I really wasn't prepared to play around with the fermentation and distillation regime, for somewhat obvious reasons that it was going to take at least 10 years before we would see the benefit of that. So I looked at changing the cask selection recipe a little bit. I even looked at incorporating a little bit of sherry cask in there, but, I rejected that fairly quickly because we have other expressions in the range to suit that taste profile. And, I looked at 10 years and 6 months. I looked at 100% first fill. I looked at 100% second fill bourbon, blah, blah, blah. I looked at 11 and a half and 12. And I then put samples of some of these experiments out to the full company tasting panel. And I was quite taken aback by the response I got. And for the 12-year-old offering, more than 95% of respondents on blind tastings actually preferred the 12-year-old. And then once I had established that fact, I looked at the stock profile, Mark, obviously, and the stock profile actually allowed us to change that. And there's no question, I was probably the biggest naysayer in making that change and was a little bit nervous about doing it. And once we started talking to the markets and talking to our distributors, particularly in the United States, guess what? Everyone was in favor of that, the change. So that's why we did it. It was as simple as that. It was to try and take something and make it even better. And, I'm sure you've done this, Mark, sitting down with a bottle of 10-year-old original and a bottle of 12-year-old original and tasting them blind. They're obviously very, very, very clearly related. But I would like to say that the 12-year-old version just has a little bit more smoothness and creaminess on the palate.
I have not had that pleasure yet because the 12-year-old just arrived here and I haven't received any samples yet. So,
well, I very much look forward to your comments on that. And even if these comments are, Bill, WTF, I prefer the 10-year-old version. that's might be the reality.
A question from Noel Harity. He's curious about the general changes you've seen since you got into whiskey and what you see for the future of whiskey in terms of maybe 1, technology, 2, industry growth, and 3, the general future outlook for the industry as a whole. a three-part question there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You might have to remind me of what the other two parts of it are, but I'll answer the part which I'm most comfortable about speaking about first, and that's the technology. And, there's a lot of things that have come along in my 40 years in the Scotch whisky industry, which there's changes in technology, most of which have been driven either for health and safety reasons or for reasons of efficiency or other things like that. And, I'm thinking, for example, of that is that there's very few distilleries these days that still operate direct fired stills. And, personally, I'm not a fan of direct fired stills. I think there's too many things that could go wrong there. So technology has sometimes changed for reasons like that. Steam coils for distillation allow you much better control of your distillation. And of course, now we're seeing the advent of external heating for stills with steam-driven heat exchangers. And, all of these things do offer benefits in terms of efficiency, but you need to balance that along with potential detrimental impacts to spirit quality. So technology is a double-edged sword, Mark. And, I'm quite particular about what things I will and will not allow to happen at our distilleries. And if I suspect there is something that's going to be detrimental to spirit quality, then I simply won't do it.
What about industry growth?
Industry growth, the Scotch whisky industry has grown spectacularly, particularly over the last 2 decades. And I'm quite interested to see that there's massively increased competition, not just from other spirits, but within the whisky category, with United States whisky, Canadian whisky, Japanese whisky, Taiwanese whisky, Indian whisky. And I think it all just is of benefit to the consumer at the end of the day. But it basically means that as Scotch whisky distillers, we cannot rest on our laurels and continue to believe that we are the leading light in the world whisky industry. Even although I actually do continue to believe that, but it basically means you have to be careful and continue to offer consumers a tremendous quality and exciting product. I don't think growth will be as steep as it has been over the last 20 years or so. I think it will continue to grow, but at a much slower pace. And obviously, we all know the political and macroeconomic factors that are potentially impacting on consumption and sales at the moment. But, in Scotland, certainly we've been around for several hundred years and we're not going anywhere soon, Mark, so we will still be here. But yeah, it's constantly changing scene out there, so you have to keep abreast with what's going on. And what was the third part?
Just the future industry growth, which you future outlook, which you already addressed.
Yeah, I think I've answered that. Yeah.
A question from me now. I've noticed on a couple of recent emails from Glenmorangie that your longtime assistant, Gillian McDonald, is now being listed as head of whiskey creation. Has she received a promotion, and are you starting to scale things back?
I'm certainly not starting to scale things back. I'm saying this slightly tongue in cheek because Catherine from our comms department is on this call. We don't always get the job titles totally correct here, but I'm often referred to as head of whiskey creation. In reality, my job title is I'm director of whiskey creation. So Gillian is still part of my team.
Got it. Wanted to make sure we clarified that. Because they're identifying you as Glenmorangie Master Distiller now, and I didn't know if you were scaling back to go play at the Lighthouse a little bit more.
No, not at all. The Master Distiller title is simply used because Director of Distilling, Whiskey Creation and Whiskey Stocks, which is my absolutely accurate job title, is a bit of a mouthful. But, Gillian has been promoted in recognition of the huge contribution she makes to the company. But, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, Mark.
Thanks to Dr. Bill Lumsden of Glenmorangie and Ardbeg for answering your questions this week. And thanks again to the WhiskyCast community members who submitted questions. WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Oban, a deliciously smooth single malt known for its coastal charm and Highland heritage, loved by whiskey lovers worldwide. Discover Oban's full lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the new Clonakilty Single Pot Still Irish Whiskey. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose has touches of brown sugar, vanilla, kiwi fruit, citrus, and a hint of caramel. The taste has notes of wood spices, tree fruits, dark chocolate, salted caramel, and orange peel, while the finish is long with touches of salted caramel, honey, and vanilla. I'm scoring the Clonakilty Single Pot Still Irish Whiskey a 92. Next up, the new sherry cask finished rye whiskey from Denmark's Stauning Distillery. It's bottled at 50.5% ABV, and the nose has wood spices, honey, vanilla, dried fruits, and salted caramel. The taste is complex with orange peel, black tea, cardamom, and hints of figs and brown sugar. The finish is long with lingering spices and hints of pipe tobacco and brown sugar. It's a very complex dram, and I'm scoring the Stauning Sherry Cask Finished Rye a 93. Finally, let's look at the 9th edition of Westland's Gariana American Single Malt. It's bottled at 50% ABV and comes from a blend of Gariana oak and Oloroso sherry casks. The nose has touches of roasted almonds, cocoa, burnt marshmallow, and subtle spices. The taste has spicy notes of clove and cinnamon bark, balanced by peach pie, burnt marshmallow, and a hint of peppermint candies. The finish is long and minty for a nice complex dram that may be the best Gariana release so far. I'm scoring the 9th edition of Westland's Gariana Single Malt a 94. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,800 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com. Let's open up the inbox now and see what people are talking about this week. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey. Noel Harity posted this comment in the WhiskyCast Community app this week. Since discovering this podcast earlier this year, I decided to go back to the beginning and am currently at episode 248 from 2009. Loving each history lesson. I figure once I finish every episode and catch back up, I should be eligible for a certificate in whiskey knowledge or something to that effect. Mark, can you sort that out? With a winking emoji. I've also attached a pic of my latest addition to my 122-bottle collection with the Lark Christmas cask bottle. I love Australian blends, and since I get to go there every month, I bring one back to San Diego. Starward is also a favorite. I have 8 bottles of their blends, as well as the Archie Rose single malt whiskeys, which are fantastic. As for that certificate, Noel, you wouldn't be the first to go back and listen to every previous episode of WhiskyCast, so I can't help you out there, but thank you for your support and your patience. After I posted the news on the UK's excise tax hike this week, we had some comments from some very unsurprised WhiskyCast community members. Christopher Glenn commented, "Politicians not keeping their word? Unheard of." Ian Bruce commented from Australia, "They weren't expecting the government not to cash in on the current high revenues coming from spirits? Looks like another manifesto lie." If you have a comment, a question, or a suggestion, we'd love to hear from you. Download the free WhiskyCast Community app from your app store and join the conversation. You can also find us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com.
That's the sound of our whiskey growing on Dunbell Farm, County Kilkenny. We know where every grain comes from. Only Irish barley, one farm, one terroir at a time. Waterford whiskey, the most naturally flavoursome single malt.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It may come as no surprise that humans aren't the only beings on planet Earth who consume alcohol. A new study from England's University of Exeter finds that the use of alcohol in various species is much more abundant than previously believed. Dr. Kimberly Hawkins of the university's Center for Ecology and Conservation argues in the report that alcohol use is much more abundant in the natural world than we previously thought, and most animals that eat sugary fruits are going to be exposed to some form of ethanol. We've all seen news stories about the occasional animal that gets blind drunk, but it appears to be more that intoxication is not the intention. The animals want the calories from ethanol, but not necessarily the side effects. However, one of the paper's authors believes the same relaxation response that occurs in humans could help in primate social structures. The researchers want to study the behavioral and social effects of alcohol use in primates in their next study. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the WhiskyCast Community app. Download it today from the Apple and Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
The 2024 release of Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition is out now, available at Dewars.com. Get it while you can and appreciate every double-aged rye cask finished dram. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2024. And comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.